Irela, a member of an ancient and highly advanced alien race, had always been curious about the countless species scattered across the galaxy. Her people, known as the Zaran, had long since perfected their ability to travel through minds, able to connect with and observe the thoughts of others, be they fellow Zarans or beings from distant planets. This ability was invaluable in understanding new species and gathering information about the worlds they encountered. One particular mission brought her to a planet known as Earth, home to a species called humans. She had heard of them before, but they had always seemed so insignificant, primitive. How could a species that relied on crude tools and primitive technology compare to the vast civilizations the Zaran had established throughout the stars? Still, Irela followed her orders and prepared to gather the data she needed. The Zaran were not cruel explorers. They took great care to avoid harming the species they studied, often making only the briefest connections with their minds, enough to understand the basics of their thoughts and cultures. So, Irela was accustomed to the procedure. She would find a human, make a brief connection, gather the necessary data, and move on to the next world. But as she began her telepathic scan of the planet, something unexpected happened. Irela reached out and connected with the mind of a human male. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with an unremarkable life. At least, that was what she thought at first. His name was Evan, and he was living a quiet life in a small, bustling town, somewhere on Earth. He had a job at a local hardware store, lived alone in a modest apartment, and seemed content. There was nothing particularly special about him, nothing to set him apart from the millions of others who roamed this planet. But as Irela began to probe deeper into his mind, she was met with a flood of images and emotions that took her completely by surprise. At first, she thought it was an anomaly, a mistake, perhaps a side effect of the connection. But as she focused harder, she realized that it was no error at all. What she saw was the raw truth of Evan's life, hidden behind the mask of normalcy he presented to the world. Evan's memories were not the simple, everyday thoughts of an average person. His mind was a battlefield, filled with painful decisions, struggles, and sacrifices that no one had ever witnessed. Irela found herself overwhelmed by the sheer weight of it all. She saw flashes of moments that were so deeply personal that they made her question the very nature of humanity. How could a species so seemingly ordinary carry such burdens? One of the first things Irela saw was Evan as a young boy. He was no different from any other child, laughing and playing with his friends. But there was a moment that changed everything. His father had been an upstanding man, a man of integrity and honor. But one fateful day, while Evan was still a child, his father had made a mistake, one that would haunt the family for years to come. It was a small mistake in the grand scheme of things, something that many people would have overlooked. But for Evan's father, it was a matter of life and death. He had accidentally harmed someone, and the consequences were far-reaching. Evan's father was a man of honor, so he did what any man of honor would do. He took responsibility for his actions. But the price he paid was steep. He lost his job, his reputation, and ultimately his freedom. His family was forced to move to a smaller town, where they were barely able to make ends meet. Evan had been too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation at the time, but as he grew older, he realized the impact it had on his family. He watched as his father, a man he had once admired, became a shadow of his former self, burdened with guilt and regret. The experience left Evan with a deep sense of responsibility. He felt an obligation to make up for his father's mistakes, to somehow restore the honor that had been lost. But as he grew older, he realized that he could never undo the damage. The best he could do was carry the weight of that burden, just as his father had. But it wasn't just the guilt of his father's actions that Evan carried. No, there were deeper sacrifices to come. Irela saw how Evan had been forced to grow up quickly, taking on responsibilities that no child should ever have to bear. At the age of 16, he had taken a part-time job to help support his family. His mother, who had once been a vibrant woman full of dreams and ambitions, had fallen ill, and it was up to Evan to help keep the household afloat. His siblings, still young, had not yet understood the depth of the situation, so Evan took on the role of protector, working long hours to make sure they had everything they needed. But Evan didn't stop there. He pushed himself further, believing that he had to make up for every mistake his father had made. He sacrificed his own dreams, his own happiness, to ensure that his family could survive. He never asked for recognition, never sought praise for his efforts. To him, it was simply what had to be done. Irela's connection with Evan's mind grew stronger, and she began to understand just how much he had sacrificed for those he loved. His entire life had been one of selflessness, of giving without expecting anything in return. He had given up his childhood, his education, and his personal desires, all in the name of duty. Even as an adult, he continued to make sacrifices. Irela saw him working tirelessly in that small hardware store, day after day, his back hunched under the weight of the world. He had never once complained, never once asked for help. He simply carried on, putting the needs of others before his own. As Irela delved deeper into his mind, she began to uncover more memories, each more heartbreaking than the last. Evan's life had been a series of choices, each one harder than the one before. He had turned down opportunities for advancement in his career, knowing that doing so would take him away from his family. He had given up on love, telling himself that there was no room in his life for a relationship. He had been content, or at least convinced himself that he was, to live a life of quiet sacrifice. Irela could feel the weight of his loneliness, the deep yearning in his heart for something more, something beyond the life he had created for himself. But he had never once acted on those desires. He had never once sought anything for himself. The more Irela saw, the more she began to question her own perceptions of humanity. She had always thought of them as a species driven by self-interest, a species focused on survival and personal gain. But what she saw in Evan's mind was something entirely different. Here was a human who had chosen to live for others, to carry the weight of the world without asking for anything in return. Here was a human who had sacrificed his own happiness for the greater good, never once asking for recognition, never once complaining. Irela began to realize that she had been wrong about humans. They were not weak. They were not insignificant. They were capable of great strength, of great sacrifice, in ways she had never before understood. As she continued to explore Evan's mind, Irela realized that she was no longer just an observer. She was a participant in his memories, feeling the same pain, the same sacrifice, the same quiet strength. She began to empathize with him, to feel what he felt, and in that moment she understood something that would change her forever. Humans, despite their flaws, were capable of unimaginable resilience. They could endure hardships that would break other species, and they did so with a quiet dignity that was beyond measure. Evan was proof of that. And as Irela withdrew from his mind, she knew that she had just witnessed something extraordinary. She had seen the true strength of humanity, not in their power, not in their technology, but in their willingness to sacrifice for others, even when the universe would never know. As Irela continued to linger in Evan's mind, she found herself drawn into the web of his life in ways she hadn't anticipated. The flood of memories she had first encountered was far deeper and more complex than she could have ever imagined. Each moment she explored uncovered another layer of his existence, revealing just how deeply he had buried his true feelings, his desires, and his pain. The further Irela traveled into his thoughts, the more she realized that this man, whom she had originally deemed ordinary, had lived a life far from it. Evan's sacrifices didn't just come in the form of giving up his childhood or his future. As she sifted through the timeline of his life, Irela saw that there was a pattern, a cycle of selflessness that Evan had unconsciously adopted. From a young age, he had learned to put others before himself, even at the cost of his own happiness. The image of his father, his once proud and strong father, came to the forefront of Irela's mind again. The story of his father's downfall, a mistake that had cost the family everything, had weighed heavily on Evan for years. Evan had watched his father's life unravel when he was just a boy, and the sense of guilt that his father carried had been passed down to him. But rather than resenting his father, Evan had taken it upon himself to bear that burden, as if it were his to carry. Irela could sense the deep love Evan had for his family, especially for his father. It was clear that despite the pain his father's actions had caused, Evan had always sought to protect and support him. Even as an adult, when the opportunity to leave and live his own life presented itself, Evan stayed. He remained by his father's side, working harder each day to provide the stability his family needed. It wasn't just duty. It was a profound sense of loyalty, one that ran deep in Evan's heart. In Irela's eyes, Evan's sense of responsibility seemed almost unnatural, a level of dedication she had never encountered before. There was no grand recognition for his sacrifices, no applause, no fame. He didn't live a life of accolades or acknowledgement. Instead, he quietly endured the weight of his choices, day after day. His life was filled with moments of discomfort, of suffering, and of putting others' needs ahead of his own. And he did it all without asking for anything in return. One particular memory struck Irela with incredible force. It was a memory of Evan as a young man, still in his early 20s. He had been dating a woman named Lena, someone who had once been the light in his otherwise difficult life. They had shared dreams of traveling together, of building a future that was bright and filled with possibilities. But as time passed, Evan's life had become more complicated and his sacrifices more frequent. He began to realize that his dreams of a happy, fulfilled life with Lena were not meant to be. The turning point came when Evan's family faced another crisis. His mother's health had worsened, and the bills were mounting. The pressure was unbearable, but Evan didn't think twice about it. He knew what needed to be done. He had to put his own desires aside, just as he had done countless times before. Lena, sensing the strain in their relationship, had begged him to stay, to join her in a new life where they could build something together. But Evan had made a choice, one that would haunt him for years to come. He chose to stay behind and take care of his family, even though it meant sacrificing his own happiness. Irela could feel the deep pain Evan had endured in that moment. She could feel the heartache he experienced as he let Lena go, knowing that he would never be able to love her the way she deserved. His heart broke as he watched her walk away, knowing that he had made the right choice, but also realizing that he had lost something irreplaceable. The pain of that loss stayed with him for years, buried deep inside, never spoken about, never acknowledged. As Irela continued to explore his memories, she saw how this pattern repeated itself over and over again. There were moments of joy, of fleeting happiness, but they were always followed by sacrifices, by difficult choices that Evan made for the good of those around him. It was as if he had convinced himself that his own desires didn't matter. He never gave himself permission to be happy or to seek out the things he wanted for himself. His life was a never-ending series of compromises, and Irela began to realize that these sacrifices were not just a part of Evan's life. They were the very foundation of who he was. But what struck Irela most was the way Evan handled it all. Despite the weight of his choices, despite the toll they took on him, he never once showed the world the true extent of his struggles. To everyone around him, he was just an ordinary man, a man who worked hard, took care of his responsibilities, and lived a simple life. But beneath that exterior was a heart full of pain, a heart that had been broken time and time again, yet continued to beat for others. Irela began to understand that this was the essence of humanity, their ability to endure, to carry heavy burdens, and to make sacrifices for the greater good. It wasn't about power or greatness. It wasn't about being recognized for their actions. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when it seemed impossible. This was the strength that Evan embodied. It was a strength that Irela had never encountered before, not in any other species she had studied. She had seen strength in many forms: physical strength, mental strength, technological prowess. But the strength Evan possessed was different. It was the strength of the heart, the ability to continue on despite everything that weighed against you. As Iraela stayed connected to Evan's mind, she felt a deep respect for him growing within her. She admired his quiet determination, his unwavering sense of duty, and his selflessness. She saw how he had given everything for the people he loved, even when it meant sacrificing his own happiness. She began to question her previous assumptions about humanity. She had believed that humans were driven by selfish desires, that they were a species that would do anything to advance themselves. But now, she saw that they were capable of something far greater. Humans, she realized, were capable of making the hardest choices, of enduring the greatest pain, for the sake of others. They could live lives filled with quiet sacrifice and never once ask for recognition. And in that moment, Iraela understood why humanity had survived for so long. It wasn't their technology or their military power, or even their ability to conquer the stars. It was their capacity for sacrifice, for enduring pain and hardship in silence. That was the true strength of humanity. And it was a strength that Iraela had never fully understood until now. Iraela's connection to Evan grew stronger, and with each passing moment she felt the weight of his sacrifices pressing down on her. She could feel the exhaustion that came with a lifetime of selflessness, the constant battle between what he wanted and what he felt was necessary. It was a battle that he had fought every day of his life, and Iraela began to understand just how exhausting it must have been. But through it all, Evan had never given up. He had never let the weight of his choices break him. He had carried on, silently bearing the burden of his sacrifices, without ever complaining. And Iraela knew deep down that humanity's true strength lay in this ability to endure, to sacrifice, and to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. As she withdrew from his mind, Iraela took one last look at the man whose life she had come to understand so deeply. Evan would never know the depths of the connection they shared, nor would he ever realize how much his sacrifices had impacted her. But in that moment, Iraela knew that she would never forget him. She would never forget the quiet strength of humanity, and she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her travels across the galaxy. As Iraela continued her journey through the labyrinth of Evan's mind, she found herself diving deeper into his thoughts and emotions than ever before. Each moment she spent in his consciousness revealed more of the man behind the mask of quiet strength. She had seen the struggles, the sacrifices, and the decisions that had shaped his life. But now she began to feel the full weight of it all, the unbearable burden of choices that no one else knew about. It was one thing to observe someone's memories, but it was another to experience them, to feel the pain and the joy as if they were your own. Iraela saw Evan's life unfold in vivid flashes, like a series of powerful scenes playing out before her eyes. Each memory was unique, yet they all shared a common thread, a thread of sacrifice and loss. He had never once let anyone see the true cost of his choices, had never once complained about the toll it took on him. He simply did what needed to be done, and in doing so, he had woven a tapestry of selflessness that was as beautiful as it was heartbreaking. One memory in particular stood out to Iraela. It was a memory that Evan had buried deep within the recesses of his mind, one that he had never spoken about to anyone. It was the day he had been called to serve in the military. Evan had never been the type of person to seek conflict, to fight for something he didn't believe in. But when his country called upon him, he answered. It was his duty, and he had always been taught that duty came before personal desires. The memory was hazy at first, but as Iraela focused on it, the details became clear. Evan had been young, eager to prove himself, yet terrified at the same time. The fear of the unknown, of leaving behind everything he knew and loved, weighed heavily on his shoulders. But he had no choice. He had volunteered for the service, just as he had volunteered for so many other things in his life. The moment he received the call, he knew that he was no longer just Evan, the quiet man who worked at the hardware store. He was now part of something much larger, something that required him to give up his own comfort for the sake of others. Evan's journey into the military was a far cry from the adventure and excitement that he had imagined as a child. It was grueling, filled with long hours, harsh conditions, and the constant threat of danger. He had been thrust into a world where nothing was certain, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. And in that world, there was no room for weakness, no space for doubt. He had to become something else, something stronger than he ever thought possible. But with that strength came a cost. Ireela felt the fear that Evan had experienced in those first few days of training, the uncertainty that gripped his heart as he stood alongside others who were far more experienced than he was. The pressure to measure up, to prove himself, had been overwhelming. But what struck Ireela the most was the way Evan had handled it. He didn't shy away from the challenge. He didn't complain. He simply did what needed to be done, even when it seemed impossible. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Evan found himself in situations that tested his very soul. He had seen death up close, witnessed the destruction of lives, and felt the crushing weight of responsibility that came with every decision he made. And in those moments when he was faced with impossible choices, Evan had always chosen the harder path, the one that required him to give more, to sacrifice more, even when it meant putting his own safety at risk. Ireela could feel the internal struggle that Evan had endured during his time in the military. There had been moments when he had wanted to walk away, when he had questioned everything he believed in, but every time he had pushed those feelings aside, knowing that the greater good was at stake. The people he cared about were depending on him, and he couldn't afford to fail them. So he kept going. He kept fighting, even when it seemed like there was no end in sight. The memory that haunted him the most, however, was the day of the mission that had changed everything. Evan had been part of a special forces team, tasked with a high-risk operation in a foreign land. The mission had been simple enough on paper: infiltrate an enemy base, gather intelligence, and return. But things had gone horribly wrong. The team had been ambushed, and Evan had found himself trapped, surrounded by hostile forces with no way out. In that moment, Ireela saw Evan's heartache. He could have saved himself. He could have taken the escape route and left his team behind. But he didn't. He stayed. He chose to fight for his comrades, even though he knew that doing so might cost him everything. It was in that moment that Ireela understood the true depth of Evan's sacrifices. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the people around him. He was willing to lay down his life for them, without hesitation. Evan's decision to stay and fight had cost him dearly. He had been wounded in the process, but it was the emotional toll that had affected him the most. He had lost friends that day, men who had been like brothers to him, and the guilt of that loss had haunted him for years. He had blamed himself for their deaths, even though he knew that he had done everything he could to save them. It didn't matter. In his mind, he had failed them, and that was something he couldn't forgive. Ireela could feel the weight of Evan's guilt as though it were her own. She could feel the loneliness that came with carrying such a burden, the emptiness that filled his heart every time he thought about those he had lost. But despite the pain, despite the overwhelming grief, Evan had kept going. He had buried those emotions deep within himself, never allowing anyone to see the toll it had taken on him. To the outside world, he was just another man, going about his life without a care. But inside, he was broken. As Ireela continued to witness the depth of Evan's sacrifices, she began to realize that there was so much more to humanity than she had ever understood. She had always believed that humans were driven by self-interest, that they were a species that only cared about their own survival. But what she saw in Evan's mind shattered that belief. Humanity, she now understood, was capable of something far greater, something she had never thought possible. Humans had the capacity to love, to sacrifice, and to endure without asking for anything in return. They could carry unimaginable pain and still continue to fight for what was right. They didn't need recognition or praise. They didn't need to be celebrated. They did what needed to be done because it was the right thing to do. And in that quiet, unspoken strength, They had an ability that no other species possessed. Evan's journey was far from over, and Irela knew that she had only seen the beginning. She had watched as he had made decisions that most beings would never have the courage to make. She had seen him choose the harder path, the one that required the greatest sacrifice. And though he would never know it, she would carry the memory of his strength with her for the rest of her travels across the stars. But there was still so much more to uncover. Irela could sense that Evan's story was far from complete. The weight of his sacrifices, the hidden pain he carried, was not something that could be resolved in a single lifetime. It was something that would stay with him, shaping the course of his future, just as it had shaped his past. And as Irela pulled away from his mind, she knew that she had just witnessed something extraordinary. Something that would change the way she viewed not just humanity, but the entire universe. As Irela withdrew from the depths of Evan's mind, she was left with a strange sense of emptiness. The connection had been unlike any she had experienced before. The emotions, the memories, the sacrifice. Each one had left its mark on her. She had been a mere observer at first, a distant traveler in another's thoughts. But now she felt as though a part of Evan's soul had intertwined with her own. The silence that followed her departure from his mind felt heavy. She had seen so much of him. His pain, his guilt, his quiet strength. But she had also seen something else. Something beyond his personal suffering. She had glimpsed his quiet resilience. The part of him that never gave up, that never turned away from doing what was right, even when it came at a cost. For the first time, Irela felt conflicted. She had always believed that her people, the Zarin, were the epitome of evolution, the most advanced and enlightened species in the universe. But they had achieved so much, mastered technologies that could bend the fabric of space and time, unlocked the secrets of life itself, and created societies of unimaginable beauty and order. They had no need for emotions, for the messy, unpredictable nature of the heart. They were above that, above the weaknesses of lesser species. But now, standing in the wake of her experience with Evan, Irela felt a growing sense of doubt. She had never thought much of humanity. To her, they were just another species, a fleeting, insignificant speck on the vast canvas of the galaxy. She had encountered countless species in her travels, many far more advanced than humans in terms of technology and intellect, but none of them had the quiet strength that Evan possessed. None of them had the capacity for sacrifice, for enduring pain without complaint, without recognition. As she drifted through the emptiness of her thoughts, Irela couldn't help but reflect on what she had learned. She had watched Evan carry the weight of his choices, the burden of his sacrifices, and she had witnessed the toll it had taken on him. Yet, through it all, he had remained steadfast. He had never once faltered, never once let his grief break him. He had continued to move forward, to fight, to sacrifice for those he loved, without ever asking for anything in return. Irela couldn't help but wonder, how could a species so seemingly ordinary possess such extraordinary strength? She had seen humanity at its worst, and the moments of weakness and fear that everyone experienced. But she had also seen humanity at its best, at its most noble, its most selfless. The love they gave, the sacrifices they made, the ways in which they fought to protect the ones they cared about, it was all so human, so raw, so real. And in that rawness, there was a kind of beauty that Irela had never expected to find. As she pondered these thoughts, she found herself drifting back into Evan's mind, unable to resist the pull of his hidden world. There was still so much more to uncover, so much more to understand. She saw his quiet moments again, those rare fleeting moments when he allowed himself to feel, the moments when he thought no one was watching. Irela saw him sitting by himself late at night, staring out of the window of his modest apartment, his face etched with the weight of his thoughts. In those moments, he was no longer the selfless man who carried the burdens of the world on his shoulders. He was just Evan, a man who had been broken by life, but who still clung to hope. Irela felt a deep sorrow for him in those quiet moments. She saw the loneliness that he had carried with him for so long, the desire for connection, for companionship, for someone to share his burdens with. But Evan had never allowed himself that luxury. He had convinced himself that he didn't deserve it, that he was not worthy of love, not worthy of happiness. And so, he had pushed everyone away. He had built walls around himself, walls that no one could break down. Yet even in those moments of self-doubt and isolation, Evan never gave up. He never turned away from his duty, from the people who depended on him. The sacrifices continued, one after another. It was as though he had accepted that his life was never meant to be easy, never meant to be filled with joy. It was meant to be hard, and that was the way he chose to live it. Irela's connection with Evan grew stronger as she watched him face another turning point in his life. His mother, whom he had cared for so deeply, had passed away. Irela saw the pain that Evan had felt in that moment, the sense of loss that had shattered his already fragile heart. She saw the tears he had shed in private, the grief that had threatened to swallow him whole. But again, he did what he always did. He buried his pain. He pushed it down deep inside, knowing that life would not stop for him to mourn. He had responsibilities. He had people who depended on him. And so, he carried on. In that moment, Irela felt something stir deep within her, something she had never felt before. It was empathy. It was a recognition of Evan's humanity that went beyond mere observation. She began to understand why he had made the choices he had, why he had sacrificed everything for others. It wasn't just duty. It was love. A love that ran so deep, so fiercely, that it consumed him. A love that made him willing to give everything, even his own happiness, for the sake of those he cared about. And in that understanding, Irela found herself torn. She had always seen love as a weakness. She had always believed that emotions, attachment, and sentimentality were the causes of suffering. But as she watched Evan, she realized that love was not a weakness at all. It was the very thing that had given him strength. It was the driving force behind every sacrifice he had made, every decision he had faced. Without love, Evan would have had nothing to live for. And without love, humanity would have had no reason to continue. But love, Irela now understood, came with a price. For all the strength it gave, it also caused pain. It caused loss. It caused sacrifice. And it was that very pain that Evan had been carrying all his life. The pain of loving others so much that you were willing to lose everything for them. And even though he had lost so much, even though the weight of it all had nearly crushed him, Evan had never stopped loving. He had never stopped sacrificing. As Irela withdrew from his mind one last time, she realized that she could never see humanity the same way again. She had come to this planet with preconceived notions, with a belief that her people were superior, that they had achieved something that humans could never hope to reach. But now she understood that humanity had something her people did not. They had the ability to love with a depth and purity that transcended everything else. They had the capacity for sacrifice, for endurance, for hope, even in the face of overwhelming pain and loss. Irela knew that she would never forget Evan, his sacrifices, his strength, his love. Those were the things that would stay with her forever. She had learned a valuable lesson during her time in his mind, that strength didn't come from power or technology, but from the heart. And as she returned to her ship, to the stars, she carried that lesson with her, a lesson that would shape the way she viewed every species she encountered from that day forward. Humanity, she realized, was not a species to be underestimated. They had a strength that no one could take away, and Evan was the living proof of that strength.